that. Okay, so fine, so it specifies your perceptions, your target, the current reality, and the likely procedure that you're going to use to make all of that interrelated. But it does more than that. So we're going to look at it from a couple of different perspectives. So the classic and archaic way of thinking about perception is the world's full of objects, you see the objects, you think about them, you evaluate them, then you act on them. It's like, no, that isn't how it works. First of all, the world is not made out of objects. The world is made out of, I think the world is made out of tools and obstacles. And it's because you can't not perceive the world in relationship to you. And what you perceive actually are the meaning of objects. You perceive the patterns. A tool is something like a meaningful pattern or a useful pattern. It's something like that. And so look, again, you look at, I might say to someone, describe this room. Now you're going to pick a level of description that's very particular. You're going to pick one that other human beings could understand. So it's going to be predicated on your size, for example. And so it's going to be predicated on your knowledge that that other person is a lot like you and has a lot of the same underlying structures and motivations. So, and that's an implicit predicate of your description. So we're going to say, well, it's kind of an ordinary classroom. It's got 20 rows of tables that each have 5 chairs at it, and each of them has 5 chairs. There's some posts that hold them up. There's a couple of speakers. There's a podium. There's a screen. There's some additional chairs. There's a scattering of people. There's some electronic equipment. And so you know, of course, that there's an infinite number of things I could be describing in this room, right? Like I could be describing, there's a lot of color variation in that tile. So if I look at it, I can see that it's unlike the other tiles because the light is reflecting off it. So it's got a shiny white element. There's about, God only knows, 1 million different scratches in it, each of which are unique. I can't even really tell what color it is. It kind of looks like an off grayish green. But if I was painting it, to get a reasonable representation, I'd have to have at least 6 or 7 shades of green ranging from quite dark to almost white. And that's only if I look at it from here. If I look at it from here, well then you get the point, right? I mean, there is an infinite number of details in this room. There's an infinite number of facts in this room. That's also why I don't believe that you can derive an ought from an is. It's like, you know, that's the old Humean issue, right? You cannot derive ethical guidelines from factual knowledge. And I think the reason for that is, which facts are you going to pick? How are you going to select them? There's an infinite number of them, even in a constrained situation. So merely by attending to some and not attending to others, you're already using an ethic. Because you can't attend to one thing and not another without being ensconced in one of these value structures. Because the value structure is what determines the direction of your attention. And so you can't make the argument that you're using the infinite number of facts that are available at your disposal to govern how you're looking at the facts. You're not. That isn't what you're doing. It's not possible to do that. So what do? Well, you describe the things in the room that would be relevant to other people. Otherwise you're going to bore them to death, or they're going to think you're insane. You know, so, or an artist maybe, because an artist might do the kind of concentration on a detail that I just described, but he's obviously or she's obviously trying to paint the thing or represent it somehow. So it's still tool-like. Well, why do you want to know that there are tables? Well, because you sit at them. Why do you want to know if there are chairs? Because you sit in them. You know, what about the screen or the camera equipment? Well, they're all usable tools. And so that's what you describe. You describe the world at the level of usable tool. Or you might also say, you know, look out for that girl who's in the third row. She's trouble. And so you might call out someone if you're describing the room, because there's somewhere in that room that if you go, you're going to get into trouble. And so those are sort of the things that seem to me to be relevant. There are tools that move you along your way, facilitators, that's another way of thinking about them. And there are obstacles that get in your way. And there's a tiny set of those. Otherwise you get overwhelmed. You're not going to go anywhere where it's all obstacles, right? You don't even want, you don't want to be in that place. You want to be in a place where it's mostly this. And then there's the biggest category though. This is what's cool. This is so important. is the biggest perceptual category is that which is not relevant at this time, because it contains everything. You know, like when you're writing on this pad, you assume the entire world around you is constant, and therefore you can ignore it. It's everything out there, all the transformations that are taking place, you turn to zero, and you just focus on maybe the space that's occupied by a single letter. Your whole world shrinks down to just that single letter, and everything else is ignored. Well, what happens if something goes wrong? This is the thing, this is why this is so important. What happens if something goes wrong? An indeterminate set of those irrelevant entities has now become relevant. That's the problem, is the invisibility disappears. And so, for example, you're all treating each other in this room right now as ignorable entities, roughly speaking. You could all be blobs from a perceptual perspective. And if you look at how you see the room, except for the person that you're focusing on, everyone else is a blob. And some of them are virtually invisible blobs. And that's fine, because you're adequately represented as a blob unless you do something that disturbs the ongoing flow of goal-directed action. Just like the gorilla thing, right? So the damn gorilla was invisible because it didn't get in the way, even though you'd think, of course, you'd see a gorilla. It's like everything that doesn't get in the way is invisible, except for that small fraction of things that you can use for your purpose. And that's how you perceive. So it's so mind-boggling, that, because it puts perception into the realm of ethics. It isn't what you'd expect. You see what you're aiming at. And you know that. You know that. You're standing on a street corner and you look up. And soon there's 10 advanced chimpanzees like you right beside you looking up to see what the hell it is that you're aiming at. Because they assume, just by watching you, that if you're focusing your perception on something and you're fixated on it, that it's relevant and important. It's tool-like or maybe obstacle-like. It's relevant for some reason. And so we live in a landscape of relevance. And that's to me, that's an absolutely mind-boggling idea, because that is way different than living in a landscape of facts. It is not the same thing, even a little bit. And there are philosophers who've pursued that idea quite, well, I would say to quite an incredible degree. Heidegger is probably the one who's done that more than anyone else. But the 19th century pragmatists were very interested in that as well. But because you know, the classic scientific idea is something like, you perceive a universe of facts and derive conclusions and act. It's like, no, you don't. You perceive a landscape of pre-categorized relevance that's dependent on your ethic. Jesus, it's so peculiar, that. And so that brings up real questions like, what ethic best structures your perceptions? Well, that is the interesting idea as far as I'm concerned. Okay, so then we can make this a little bit more interesting, I think is the right way of thinking about it. Okay, well, so you've got tools and obstacles, but they're not dead. That's the other thing. Because we're in an ethical landscape, because we're in a motivated landscape, whether something is a tool or an obstacle actually matters to you. And we can actually define matter. Matter's a weird word, because there's matter, and then there's the things that matter. And you could say the world is made out of matter, or you could say that the world is made out of things that matter. And I would say you act like the world is made out of things that matter. You might say, I don't believe that, I believe it's made out of matter. But no, you don't, because that's not how you act. It might be what you say you do, but it is not what you do. So why do things matter? Well, first of all, irrelevant things don't matter. And thank God for that, right? Because if everything mattered, it's, well, you're either in the midst of an LSD trip, or you're schizophrenic, or you're in real serious trouble. So you want most things to be irrelevant. Now that's kind of dull, and it takes the glory and the glamour out of the world, but from a cognitive perspective, it's definitely an advantage. So irrelevancy, man, that's critical. And a huge amount of what you have done is learned irrelevance. It's the basis of your cognitive knowledge, is learned irrelevance. What to ignore. Okay, fine, so that zeroes things out. You turn most of the world into zero. Well, then you have this small subset of things that are beneficial to you, that you can use for the purposes of your current operation, which we'll define in more detail. You can use that for the purposes of your current endeavor. And then you have obstacles. And so, for example, if I'm late for class, so I'm in a particular state of mind, and I walk in here and I see that, I'm going to get a little burst of negative emotion. It's irritation. And the reason for that is not a recycling bin then. It's an obstacle that some dimwit left there just to annoy me. And I mean, you know what I mean. That's how you react to the world in a situation like that. It's like, it's not a recycling bin. If it's here, and I don't want to stand there, then it's a recycling bin. If it's there, it's an obstacle. And as soon as I look at it, it isn't that I see it and then get annoyed. It's that annoyance is part of the perception. Because it's an obstacle in my pathway, the emotion comes along with the perception. It's not laden on top of it. It's not, oh, I don't think that's a recycling bin. That's in the wrong place. Now it's in my way. I should be annoyed. That isn't what happens, is the annoyance. My suspicions are that the damn annoyance is faster than the object perception, because it's a more primordial circuit. So you actually, now there's a great book if you're interested in this sort of thing. There's a great book called An Ecological Approach to Visual Perception, which was written by a guy named Gibson back in the 70s, and it's brilliant. His fundamental conclusion is, I think, wrong, but it doesn't matter. The book is not only brilliant because, see, he was the guy that came up with the idea of affordance. And an affordance is something that affords some utility, and that can be positive or negative. And he thought about the world as being full of furniture, roughly speaking, something like that. And that what you saw, what you perceived directly was the affordance. And so imagine the visual cliff experiment. So let's say I put a piece of glass over top of the space between these two tables, no chair there. And I take a duck, and I put the duck here, and the duck walks out on the glass. The duck doesn't care. It'll just walk out on the glass. Well, it's an aquatic animal, and so if there's depth underneath it, it doesn't really bother a duck. But if you put a human infant on there, old enough to crawl, the human infant will look over and it's not going on that glass. And you might say, well, what does it see? And you could say it sees a space between the two tables and infers that it might fall, but it's like 8 months old. Like, what the hell? It's inferring that? No, it's not. It sees a place to fall off of. And that's Gibson's fundamental point, is that you don't see a cliff, you see a falling off place. And of course, why wouldn't you see that? Because if that isn't what you saw, you wouldn't be here, because one of your dopey ancestors would have wandered off the cliff and died. The ones that saw a falling off place, they just stayed away from that. And you know, if you have vertigo, and even if you don't, if you're up on the 35th floor of an apartment building and you walk out onto the balcony, it's really interesting to notice your perception, because you might think, well, you see the space and you become afraid. It's like, no, you don't. You walk closer to it and your body, you perceive the damn thing with your body. You can also see it, but you perceive it with your body. It's like, don't go there. Don't go any closer. And there's an automatic mapping of that place onto do this. Go away from there. And that's underneath and faster than the actual, quote, conscious object perception.